Hello students, I am Sanjay Mate, Assistant Professor at ISMR, Nigri, Pune. In this video, we are going to see Introduction to JavaScript. The contents of this video are, first of all, we'll see what is JavaScript. After that, we'll see what is the history of JavaScript, how it is developed, and what are the story behind that. After that, we are going to see the features of this JavaScript, and at the last, we will see where this JavaScript being used. So let's see what is JavaScript. So JavaScript is nothing but a programming language which is object-based and functional-based as too. So this language is used for making the dynamic web pages. In the early, the web pages are very static. Only they are displaying the contents. But nowadays we came across the web pages on which that there is a response whenever the user scrolls the mouse or whenever the user is going to click the buttons, the color of the button gets changed. The drop-down pop-up menus came. So that is nothing but the dynamic. So that dynamic property is given by this JavaScript. Interpreted language. The JavaScript is an interpreted language. It is not going to use the compiler. So therefore, whenever you are using the interpreted language, this language executes very fast. Next, lightweighted. So JavaScript is running at the client side and it is having very small code. Therefore, it is executed very fast and it doesn't require many more resources. History of JavaScript. The JavaScript is developed by Brendan H. in 1995 in Netscape Communications. So why did this particular language is developed? In the early days, the web pages are used for presenting the static data. The contents of this particular websites are static. Only the textual information will be there. After that, the browsers, the companies of these browsers, for example, Microsoft, then Safari, Mozilla, they started to implement the colors, then fonts, then font size in these web pages. The Brandon Each, he decided why we cannot do something more with this particular browsers. So for that, he developed one language. That language is nothing but JavaScript in 1995. Originally, this language is known as Mocha. After that, it is renamed with LiveScript. In that days, the web gains the popularity. There is everywhere internet is there. And in that case, the development of client-side scripting language are required because there is very less speed. They are going to use the modems. And for sending the information from one client to server and from again getting back that information to the client, it is very time consuming. So what he thought that why should not we do some tasks at only client side? So this thought gives him a birth to this JavaScript. Earlier it is known as LiveScript, but later Netscape changed its name to JavaScript because in their days, the Java is very popular. JavaScript is released its first look in Netscape 2.0 in 1995 under the name LiveScript. After that, the Microsoft also developed the same language, same type of language called as JavaScript. They have reverse engineered and they are trying to compete with this JavaScript. But before that, that JavaScript is standardized and therefore it is well known. The purpose of this JavaScript is used in many more functions, in many more things. First, input validation. So input validation is nothing but whatever the information we are getting, we are checking that information at client side only. So we are not sending that information to the server. Let's take one simple example. If I want to add two numbers, so for adding two numbers, first of all, I'm taking that two numbers from the user. And then I'm sending that two numbers to the server. Then server adds that two numbers, and again it will send that two numbers back to the client, and then it will be displayed. It takes a large amount of time and bandwidth also. But instead of that, we can add these two numbers at client side. There is no any requirement or use of the server. So that particular thing is done in the JavaScript. Whatever the things we can, whatever the functionalities we can operate or we can do at client side without using the server, that can be done at in this JavaScript. Where is the JavaScript being used? The client side validations. That is what I have already told. That you can validate the form. You can check the text field, whether the text field is empty or what. Whether the user entered the wrong data type or wrong information in that particular text field. For example, if you want the number, the phone number, and if user enters the text. So you can check that thing at the client side only. Then you will get the drop-down menus, pop-up windows, and dialog boxes on this web page to load asynchronous data without refreshing the page. So you don't need to refresh the page, and therefore your website is very fast and responsive. JavaScript can be used in the web developments. Advantages of JavaScript. So first of all, the JavaScript is having the great speed. Why the speed came? Because whenever you are taking the information, that information is not sent, most of the information is not sent to the server. That is executed at browser end only, in the browser only, and using the interpreter. So for that, compilation time is also reduced, and sending the information to the server and getting back to the client is not required. Therefore, you will get the maximum speed. After that, the second one is simplicity. JavaScript is very simple to learn, it's very simple to write. It have the features of all programming languages. If you know for loop, if you know while loop, you can write this JavaScript very easily. Even though if the particular user is not knowing the programming language, he can also write the programs. Next is versatility. Versatility means what? This language can be embedded in many other languages. Versatile. And you can use these languages for many web applications. And at the last is server load. Now you have totally reducing the server load. Whatever the processing you can do on the data, that can be done at the client side. So server load gets reduced in this JavaScript. A simple example we'll take. If we want to write a simple program of hello world. So if you want to write this simple program using the machine code or in the assembly language, it is looking like this, V821 and all that things. It is more complex and it is not so easy to understand. But the same code, if I want to write for displaying the hello world in the JavaScript, I need to write only alert, and in that I'm writing hello world. That's all. Therefore, it is very simple to write and easy to learn. Now, this JavaScript is interpreted language. So before that, going to see what is interpreter, compiler. So let's see what is the use of these two things. Whenever you are writing any code or any source code that is written in the human readable format or in human readable language, but the computer doesn't know this type of particular instructions. So we need to convert these instructions from the human readable to machine understanding language or machine understanding symbols. So who will do this? So this will be done by compiler and interpreter. So what is compiler? So compiler is nothing but it will take your source code, then it will compile that source code into an intermediate language, and this intermediate language is then converted into the low-level language or machine understandable language. And then machine will execute this particular code. Examples of this compiler-based languages are Java, C, C++. So all these are heavy languages, and these languages, first of all, we need to write the code. If the code is of 10 lines or 100 lines and 1000 lines, first of all, write whole code and then give this whole code to the compiler. Then compiler is a system tool which will take this code, which will parse this code, which will read this code, and it will find, or if the errors are not there, it will convert that code to an intermediate code. And then this intermediate code will be converted into the machine code, and then this machine code will be executed by the computer or machine. What happens in the interpreter, or what is the functionality of interpreter? So interpreter is nothing but it will take line by line code, it will execute it directly. It doesn't wait for whole program to write. Once we have written one single line, it will be direct, and whenever you are pressing the enter, that particular line gets executed immediately. So that is nothing but the interpreter. So which languages are there which are interpreted? Ruby, PHP, right? And of course the JavaScript. These are the languages for which the interpreter is used. Yeah. So what is the difference? If you are executing something many times, and if in that case we are going to use the compiler if the changes are not frequent, because if you are doing the changes in the code, you need to compile that whole code, even though the code is of 1000 lines or 2000 lines, whole code again, and then you need to execute it. But if the frequency of modifications are more, then we can go for the interpreter. So interpreter, what it does, if you are changing, if you are having lines of 1000 code, you need to only change one particular line, and that can be executed directly. No need to compile whole code. So that is what the advantage of interpreter. So first of all, this particular structure or this particular JavaScript is included in the HTML language. So before that, you should know what is HTML language. So HTML language is nothing but hypertext markup language. And then we are having the CSS, and for that we are having the JavaScript. So all these things we are going to learn in the next video. Thank you. Thank you very much.